Good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our program, U.S. Immigration and Border Policies, a discussion with Efrén C. Olivares of Southern Poverty Law. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an Adult Services Specialist for Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight, we are joined by author Efrén C. Olivares and moderator Nan Shivoni. They will discuss Efren's new book, My Boy Will Die of Sorrow. Now I would like to introduce our guest for tonight. Nan Shivoni is the legal director at Justice in Motion, a national nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that migrants are treated fairly and have equal access to justice across borders. For the past 5 years, Nan has led Justice in Motion's effort to reckon with the fallout from President Trump's family separation policy, felt most acutely by separated parents who were deported without their children. She has been both an active participant in the ACLU's MSL versus ICE litigation steering committee and an eager NGO partner to President Biden's Family Reunification Task Force. Her team, which includes human rights defenders in the Justice in Motion Defender Network, has managed many hundreds of on-the-ground searches for families in Mexico and Central America, with the goal of connecting them to a reunification pathway, justice, and healing. Efrén C. Olivares is the Deputy Legal Director of the Immigrant Justice Project at Southern Poverty Law Center. He was the lead lawyer in a successful landmark petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on behalf of families separated under the zero tolerance policy. He previously directed the Racial and Economic Justice Program at the Texas Civil Rights Project. His writings on immigration policy have also been published by the New York Times, USA Today, and Newsweek, and he has testified before Congress and at briefings on Capitol Hill about immigration and border policies. Part of his work representing separated families was featured in the CBS News documentary, The Faces of Family Separation, released in October 2019. He has also been interviewed as an expert attorney on immigrants' rights, issues on numerous TV and radio shows, and was featured in John Legend's Can't Just Preach series. Olivares was the first member of his family to attend college. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Yale Law School. Please welcome Nan Shivoni and Efrén C. Olivares.
So much, Miriam and Gwinnett Public Library. So, Efrén, congratulations on this wonderful book, very important story that you have. I'd love for you to just start us off with a brief overview of your work.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you to the Gwinnett County Public Library for hosting me. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you who are joining us tonight. Before I start, I just want to give a quick content warning that some of the topics discussed in the books and some of the topics we will touch on tonight involve child abuse, family separation, torture. I thought I would start by giving a quick overview of the book and then delve into a conversation with Nan and then open it up to questions that you all might have. In May of 2018, I walked into a federal courtroom in McAllen, Texas, about 6-7 miles from the Mexican border. I was, at the time, 10 years out of law school. I had been in that building many times before for other civil rights litigation matters, but I had never seen this courtroom like this. The benches that are typically reserved for the public were jam-packed, wall to wall, all of them, with men and women of all ages, handcuffed, shackled, looking tired and sleep-deprived, wearing clothes that have been worn for too long. Even the smell in the courtroom was different that day, smell of sweat and dust. And those men and women were immigrants who had crossed the border a day or two prior. And I was there that morning to ask if any of them had been separated from a child. Most of them were confused. They thought this was immigration court. that they were going to get to present their case in front of a judge who would get to decide their asylum case or whether they stayed in the country. But this wasn't immigration court, this was federal criminal court. They were being charged with this law that had been in the books for nearly 80 years, that makes it a misdemeanor, so a minor crime, to cross the border without authorization. And it carries the same penalty as running a stop sign at the Pentagon. But a couple of weeks prior, the then Attorney General had made an announcement that going forward, everybody who crossed the border would be charged with this misdemeanor. And if you had been traveling with a child, you would be separated from your child. Even after that announcement was made, it was hard for me to believe that that could happen, right? That in the United States of America, where the rule of law is paramount, our government would take children away from their parents without any process, let alone due process, and with no information about where they were being sent or when the parents might see them again. So when I walked in that morning and I asked the question if anybody had been separated from their child, 5 parents raised their hand or tried to raise their hand because they were handcuffed. And what they told me caught me unprepared. They had been led to believe that their children would be back at the Border Patrol station later that afternoon, but we knew that that wasn't the case, that there was no information about when they might see their children again, who would care for them, where they were being sent, and there was really no plan to bring them back together. So standing in a corner of the courtroom, we took down their information and their children's information, name, date of birth, country of origin. And we heard over the next few weeks, you all might remember the headlines, but we heard stories, heartbreaking stories of mothers like Viviana, whose husband had been murdered in Guatemala and who fled Guatemala to save herself and her son. And when she thought she had made it, Border Patrol agents took her son, sent him to a shelter, and sent her to a federal prison across the country. Or fathers like Mario Perez, who was separated from his daughter, who was less than 3 years old, sent her to El Paso and kept him at a federal detention center there in South Texas. And if we had time, I could go over dozens of stories like those. And over the next month or so, there in McAllen, which is one courthouse along the border, and there are about 19 all along the border, we interviewed nearly 400 parents separated from their children. But what I didn't realize at the time, and what would take me many months to realize, was that but for a couple of decades and other policies, I could have been one of the children separated from my parents. I grew up in northeastern Mexico, and for the first 9 years of my life, I thought my life was always going to be in Mexico. All my family was there. But at the age of 9, when I was in 4th grade, my father moved to the US in search of work. He moved to South Texas, and my mother, my siblings, and I stayed behind. And we didn't see him. We saw him only occasionally for the following 4 years when he was able to visit. We couldn't visit him because we didn't have the visa. And at the time when you're 9 or 10 years old, you don't think much of that. It's just sort of your situation and kind of the hand that life dealt you. My friends' parents would come home at 5 or 6 in the evening, and my dad came back 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. But over time, as I grew up and became an adult, I started to realize the impact that not having my father around had on me and my identity and who I've become. Not having him around, every night at the dinner table, or when a medical emergency arose, or for significant school milestones, and how that shaped my identity as an immigrant and now as an advocate to do the work that I do. So my book is a braided narrative of these 2 stories, the stories of the hundreds of families that we try to interview, locate, and help reunite, document the separations, as well as my own immigration story of coming to the US as a teenager and being apart from my father along the way, along with some reflections about the history of immigration law and policy in the US, and how have immigrant families been treated in the past. Was 2018 an anomaly, or was it, the latest manifestation of policies that treat certain immigrants differently than others? And yeah, that is a brief overview of my book, and happy to go into more detail. I would, I pass it on to you, Nan, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it took you months before you recognized yourself in some of the stories that you had been, witnessing with families that were separated. Can you tell us about that moment when you first realized that you could see yourself in the story as part of this story of separated families?
Yes, it was the very first time I thought of my experience as in any way similar. And I want to be clear, it's not the same. I don't mean to compare myself to what my clients went through, right?
If it was, you would have realized it right away.
Right, exactly. Some would say that my family chose to be separated. The realities of economic necessity and geopolitics made us have to go through that, whereas my clients were forcibly separated and violently separated in many cases. But it was at my university, at my alma mater, in the spring of 2019, so in April. So a good 7 or 8 months later, I was invited to speak to first-generation college students like myself, like I had been. And many of them were first-generation immigrants who had come to the US as children. So in speaking to them about the work we were doing, not only around family separation, but other immigrants' rights issues, and at the time, issues around the border wall, and telling them about that, I also, included some points about my own experience as a first-generation college student and first-generation immigrant. And that was the first time that I realized, oh yeah, I guess I was apart from my dad for those 4 years. And I guess that was hard. That was the very first time I had this thought. But even then, I didn't fully reflect on what it must have meant for my mother. That didn't happen until I was writing the book, where I really appreciated, in the broader sense, what that experience must have been for my mom, who stayed behind to raise primarily my younger brother and I. My older siblings were a little older, by herself, right? And figuring out, trying to make ends meet before the next time my father visited. And, I reflected on how often we hear the heartbreaking and life-risking stories of people who make the journey to the US, but we don't often hear about those who stay behind. And those are often the mothers. So in the process of writing the book, I continue to grapple with what that has meant for my mother and our family.
And I want to talk about your mom more and those evocative memories that you write about. But I want to just I'm really curious, and I think our audience will be curious of why you felt like you needed to write this book. A lot of people have something to say, but few people actually go ahead and go through with it, right? So tell us about that decision to actually focus and write this book.
There were a few stories of the separated families that I really wanted to memorialize, either because they were extremely compelling and heartbreaking, or because the stars had aligned in some unexpected way and we were able to find the daughter and try to arrange for a phone call. There were a few stories like that I was like, I've got to put this down and not let it be lost to history and the loss of memory. So that was part of it. And in the spring of 2019, when I made this connection to my own experience, I felt like my perspective on this atrocity that was the family separation crisis was perhaps unique in some ways, that I could have a voice that not many people had to share these stories from the perspective of someone who also had to leave home and move to another country where I didn't speak the language, where I didn't know the culture, and start over. So I felt like that was a voice worth sharing. And that was the reason I decided to write the book. In the process, I also then appreciated how important and meaningful this has become for my family to document our story and what we went through. And that has been at a personal level extremely moving and valuable for me and my family, sharing with some of my siblings, things that we had never discussed, that now having the book and having the story out there has sort of catalyzed certain conversations that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, had I not written the book and had I not decided to share some of those. So that has been a beautiful process on a personal level.
So returning to your mom, and I would like to focus on that for a bit. There are so many impactful stories you tell about your childhood, and it's really amazing to think about her sacrifices and the struggles, the financial struggles, but also the joy that really came through in bringing up you and your brother, even without your dad. What was it like to conjure up those evocative memories of your mom, the home life, especially of the food? And I'm just curious if there is a story that you want to share, if there's something you want to read from about your mom, and after you read it, I do want to know how the memories came to you.
Yeah, there is a brief excerpt that I would love to read and share. And this is early on in the book when my dad had been gone for about a month. And in this part of the book, I'm talking about how it wasn't really clear in some ways whether my dad was gone or he was just gone for a few days, because he would come back once a month or every 3 weeks or so. So he didn't take all of his clothes with him. Some of his clothes were still there. Some of his tools were around, like his gardening tools. He had a guitar, so his guitar was there. So I'm in this part of the book, I'm reflecting on in some ways he was gone, definitely gone, but in some other ways he wasn't. That he was indeed gone was most noticeable in the evenings when my mother tried to bolster our spirits by making what she pronounced was our favorite dinner dish, parecitos de manteca, little pears of beef tallow. These pears were a simple yet delicious concoction. Take 2 tortillas, rub some beef tallow on each of them, maybe get lucky and include a few tiny crumbs of beef that sank to the bottom when the broth was separated from the tallow, pair them together, and then warm them up in the comal, a thin griddle used to cook and warm tortillas. Be sure not to leave them on for too long because the tortillas might get toasted, becoming hard and crispy, and no one wants that. They are meant to be rolled into a long and tight taquito, evenly distributing the grease. The tallow should be fully melted and the tortillas piping hot, but still soft enough to be able to roll them. Sometimes the tallow would fall out of the tortilla into the comal, releasing a hiss of steam and a wonderful smell that tempted my brother and me as we waited, shirtless, seated at the round kitchen table. We dined on these pieces of heaven a couple of times a week, and some weeks more often, when my dad hadn't come home for a while. On the rare weekends when he did come, bringing chicken and bread and bologna for sandwiches, my mom did not need to get us creative in the kitchen. And that experience and that memory of those pears of beef tallow is something that had stuck with me. And when I was writing the book, but before it had been published and before I had shared with anyone that story was part of the book, my brother at a gathering at his house on a weekend, he told my mom in front of me, like half jokingly, like, do you remember that you would feed us just tortillas and beef tallow? Like, do you remember that? Like, what was that about? So I felt vindicated in that memory that my brother also remembered it, and kind of reflecting on it, it's like, yeah, this is not, I wasn't making things up, and realizing the impact that that had, and becoming a teenager and then an adult. I was not alone in that process, my brother too.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey in immigrating here to be with your dad when your family chose to be together, and like kind of what that was like, and maybe contrast how you were able to make that happen in the time. It was in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And just maybe contrast that with what families go through today.
Yes, my father left in 92, and we joined him in 96, in 1996, 4 years later. He left in February of 92, and we left in January of 96. So almost 4 months, 4 years to the month. My grandfather was actually born in the US. So because of that, my dad was able to get his paperwork in order to come to the US. And eventually he was able to petition for us to also join him. And I remember vividly how we got a visa to be able to cross and visit as a tourist, and then as tourists. And then once we were in the US, we were able to submit the paperwork to apply to become legal permanent residents first. That process, though, required that while the application was pending, we don't leave the country. And that's something that my parents hadn't fully considered, that we would, once we moved, my dad, who was a US citizen, he could leave, but my mom, my siblings, and I, we couldn't leave the country, so we wouldn't be able to visit family in Mexico. And it could take who knows how much, right? At the time, they predicted 4, 6, 7 years. So the idea that we wouldn't be able to see our family for that long was almost meant that we wouldn't do it. And in retrospect, what a privilege, right? To have that choice, to be able to apply and go through the process, when most families who leave never even consider the possibility of returning to their homes, seeing family again. Some flee for their lives, right? So the fact that that was a consideration for us, it's not lost on me that it was a blessing and a privilege, but it was still a significant consideration that delayed us in actually applying for the green card, because my parents were trying to figure things out, knowing that once you submit the paperwork, you can't go until your paperwork is approved. So that's how we were able to do it. We applied in 96, and my green card was granted on November 30th, 2000. 1 month exactly before the deadline to apply for college. I was a senior in high school, and I still didn't have a green card, so I didn't have a social security number, so I wasn't eligible for financial aid. And I was a good student at the top of my class, but without financial aid, I was going to be very limited on where I could go to college. Just, again, the stars lining up, and sometimes the universe conspiring in my favor. I got the green card just in time to be able to apply as a resident for financial aid, and go to, like, that opened up so many doors that undoubtedly have led me to where I am today.
And one thing that I really enjoyed about your book is how you interweave your own personal narrative and your story with, the adult Efrén, reckoning with the crisis. And in doing that and telling your story, you describe various encounters with the education system in the US. Everything from a story about a teacher who helps you pass your English test, right? You talk about your high school graduation speech, and of course the stories about going to college, and in law school. And I'm curious, there's a through line of these stories about the importance of teachers, whether they're inspiring or whether they're foils to maybe your progress. And I'm curious about, and I don't want to give, I want everyone who's listening to read the book and to experience all these stories, but I'm curious if you could just reflect on how you think that prepared you for the moment of that you found yourself in the spring of 2018, all those moments through the education system in the US as an immigrant kid.
I think the certain individual teachers that have believed in me and pushed me in the good sense of the word to motivate me to strive for more goes back to even some teachers I had in Mexico. Some really good teachers who encouraged me and saw some potential in me. And then in the US, I, as you shared, critical moment in middle school, and then a few really supportive teachers in high school who I'm still in touch with, right? So who went to my book talk in McAllen when I presented the book, and that was also very, very moving. And I do believe that none of us can take full credit for who we are, what we do. We are, at the end of the day, at least in part, a product of our environment and the people we have encountered along the way. And I strongly believe that I've been fortunate to have some really supportive teachers. I think once I got to college, things changed, and that became, I had some supportive, but I had more instances of where professors were, like you were saying, foils or challenges, shall we say. And it was all public school until I got to college. So despite the problems with the quality of our public schools in this country, I feel like there are teachers who believe in students, who have the vocation to be instructors and teachers and supporters. And I feel so fortunate that I've had so many of them in my life. They have been almost always English teachers, interestingly, the ones that have been very supportive and have been instrumental in my schooling and my education.
Led you to be able to be such a beautiful writer. So fast forwarding to lawyer Efrén down there, in the Valley in May of 2018, you opened up our space tonight talking about, what you saw in that courtroom. I'm curious about, as you were trying to strategize with your colleagues about how to respond, kind of what you considered as you were putting together your response.
You mean the legal response, the legal challenge?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. You talk in the book. I mean, there's beautiful, and everyone needs to read this because it's really brilliant, strategy of human rights abuses. And I'm just curious how you came up with that.
Yes. So at the time, this is May 2018, before this had made the news or was any headlines. But we saw right away, the second time we went to court to interview parents, it was not 5, it was 12, and then 17, and then 25. So the numbers were growing exponentially by the day. In fact, they had 2 shifts, the morning shift and the afternoon shift, like a conveyor belt. And legally, we had some difficult challenges, right? On the criminal side of it, the crime was crossing the border between ports of entry, right? Instead of crossing through the bridge at a designated point, they crossed between ports of entry, swimming or rafting across the river. And 2, they had no authorization to be in the US. So they had committed this misdemeanor. It was hard to challenge that. On the immigration side, they could fight their immigration case and apply for asylum, but some of them did not have strong asylum claims. So it was hard none of them were US citizens. It was hard to claim that their immigration proceedings were anything other than regular immigration proceedings. But there was still something at a visceral level, right? How can you take a child from somebody without any process whatsoever? And look at it from the perspective of the child. You're taking their parent away, and who knows when they're going to see them again. Like there's something definitely wrong about that. Like, what can we do about it, right? What are the limits? What are the options of our legal system or of our judicial system to challenge something like that when the parent did commit this misdemeanor and they were going to face their immigration deportation proceedings. At the time, there was a class action already pending out in California by the ACLU and others to challenge the separation, right? That case became fundamental in trying to stop the separations, even though it had started before the separation started at such a large scale. So we didn't want to derail any of those efforts either. So what we decided to do instead was go to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It's a body based in DC, but it has members from all of the Americas, from Canada all the way down to Argentina and the Caribbean. And it's not very commonly used here in the US, but its mandate is to prevent and monitor violations of human rights. And from our perspective, the family separation policy was clearly a violation of human rights, both of the parents and the children, regardless of what the criminal law says, and regardless of what immigration law says. Taking somebody's child, taking somebody's parent, without any process whatsoever, not even documentation, violates their human rights. So we decided to go that route and file this emergency proceeding that, even though it took them 2 months, even though it's supposed to be for emergencies, it took them 2 months to decide. But what it allowed us to do was to frame the family separation policy in the terms of human rights, international human rights law. Countries, including the US, have taken it upon themselves to, whenever they are enacting laws and policies, respect the best interest of the child. So when viewed in that light, the family separation policy, the zero tolerance policy, was clearly in violation of the best interest of the child. So again, it took them 2 months, but we were able to advocate on a daily basis on the news, writing op-eds, giving interviews, the families who gave their consent, sharing their stories for advocacy purposes. And eventually we were part of the efforts to get the broader American public to turn against this policy.
So at this point, you're just talking to the parents, right? Can you describe what you observed with the parents? I mean, I'm sure, and this is sort of the part, right, that gets hard to talk about. I, of course, was involved in the response as well. And, I still get emotional when I think about the stories that I heard. Are there some that come to mind, or any details that, maybe you left out of the book that you want to share?
Yeah, one of the moments when sort of the level of cruelty surpassed what I was expecting was a phone call I had with one of the parents. So when we interviewed them in court, again, like you were saying, it was only the parents. And one of our first efforts was to try to locate the child, right? So we would call the shelters, and we have the children's name, date of birth. We're the lawyers for the parent. We're trying to set up a phone call. And the bureaucracy was such that the shelters were not used to arranging phone calls with detained parents. They were used to phone calls with parents at home or relatives at home. And the detention centers similarly they were not used to arranging phone calls from the detention center where the parents were to a children's shelter. So it was just a back and forth, and at every step of the way, the bureaucracy was working against us. So there was this one mom who was headed to Denver, and we had been trying for weeks to get her to speak on the phone to her daughter. And one time in mid-June, she called me and, "Hi, Anna, how are you doing? Have you been able to speak with your daughter?" And she breaks down crying on the phone. So my first reaction is frustration. I was like, these people, again, we've been trying for weeks and they just won't arrange a phone call. And she's like, no, I did speak with her. I'm like, oh, great news. That's wonderful. Then why are you crying? I thought you'd be happy that you were able to speak to your daughter finally. And she said, well, yeah, we did speak, but for 5 minutes. all we did was cry on the phone. And she kept saying, "Mommy, why did you leave me? Why won't you come and get me?" And that realization, right, which is so simple and basic, but up until then, it hadn't crossed my mind that from the children's perspective, that's it. Mommy left. Why won't she come and get me? What does a 6, 7-year-old know about borders or zero tolerance or immigration law? From their perspective, mom or dad left them. And that was just so painful to realize and to feel part of the system, to feel part of what inflicts this pain on parents and children alike. And it's a challenge that I continue to grapple with.
And I know you heard stories about the moment of separation, and as I know as well, I mean, some parents kind of knew that that the separation was going to happen. They were kind of got tipped off by an agent that before they were separated, and others it totally came by surprise. And I just think it's so interesting, the range of ways that you deal with the situation you're in. We're both parents, right? And you never know how you would face that reality. In the book, you talk about a dad named Arturo, and I would love for you to kind of share this story from your book. You can maybe read this section. What strikes me about this, just to set it up, is how we deal with trauma and how we prepare for trauma.
Yeah, this is a father that I met in court the day after Father's Day in June. The day before, outside of the facility, there was a Father's Day rally against the family separation. And the next morning, I met him in court. And like before, we were I'm trying to find it.
Page 92.
Thank you. Thought I had marked
For
it.
everyone who's following along.
When did you cross? I asked Arturo the following day in court at the Benson Tower. El sábado, he said in a soft, friendly voice. In blue jeans and red t-shirt, he looked a little younger than me, and I confirmed that when he gave me his date of birth. He was going to turn 33 in less than a month, in July. I noticed a couple of long, jagged white lines around the neck of his t-shirt, the unmistakable remnants of dry sweat stains from the past few days. Like every other defendant in the courtroom, Arturo was wearing the same clothes he had on when he was taken into custody near the river. When he spoke, a whiff of his overnight breath was still perceptible. Like the others, he had likely not been given toothpaste or a toothbrush while at the Border Patrol station. Arturo was a bit shorter than me, probably 5'9" or so, with a perpetual smile on his face. A smile that revealed his large, yellowing teeth and signaled politeness every time he answered one of my questions. He smiled and nodded when he said that this was his second time coming to the United States. He smiled and nodded when he said he was from outside El Progreso in northwest Honduras. He smiled and nodded when he said that he and Miriam, his 7-year-old daughter, had come to the United States alone. He smiled and nodded when he added that Miriam's mother had left them when Miriam was 3. So he had raised her all by himself. And he smiled and nodded when he said they had crossed on Saturday. Arturo and Miriam had left Honduras because his daughter, even at that young age, had started being threatened and harassed by the gangs, and the police offered no protection. They were headed to Santa Barbara, California, where Arturo's sister lived. As I filled out my intake form, he smiled and nodded and said that he was separated from Miriam 2 nights prior, their first night after they turned themselves into a Border Patrol agent upon crossing the river. An agent in a green uniform came to his cell that evening, he said, and told them that he was going to take his daughter away. At least he told you the truth and told you in advance, I thought. He nodded and his teeth showed again. And what did you do? He smiled shyly and said, very matter-of-factly as he continued nodding. Well, I told her that later that night, an agent was going to come and get her to take her to a summer camp. His smile was still there. ¿A un campamento de verano? I asked, perplexed, not really following. He nodded gently, tilting his head to the left and shrugging a little. His timid smile could no longer conceal the look of anguish on his face. I couldn't fully articulate, even in the thoughts in my head, that he had made up this story for his daughter. Our interviews were usually quick and dirty. Get the critical identifying information, chop, 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 and move on to the next without wasting any time. So my mind wasn't quite ready to fully grasp the implication of what he was saying. My gaze met his as I stopped writing and looked up, and my eyes must have widened as I realized what he meant. Arturo noticed that it had finally clicked for me. Oh, I see, I said. What did she do? What did she say? No, pues she went with him, bien contenta. Really happy, Miriam left with the agent with a big smile on her face, he said as he nodded, seemingly pleased that his ploy to spare his daughter the trauma from the separation had succeeded. To this day, I cannot comprehend how, sitting in a cold cell after weeks of traveling through Mexico and Guatemala, El Salvador, he managed to find it in himself to make that story for his daughter. I reached out to him weeks after that and confirmed that they had been reunited in California. So that was good, but it's a story that has stayed with me and will stay with me forever. That resilience and that, I don't even know what to call it. The ability to on the spot in such circumstances, come up with a story to spare his daughter the suffering.
I'm in the your book, the themes of empathy and compassion, kind of comes through, and I think that's one thing that you want people to be empathic and compassionate towards each other, to migrants, to the other. I want to talk about how there was a sort of a turn in the tide of public opinion in June of 2018, and how it was spawned by an audio recording of a child, of the children crying. And anyone who was paying attention to the news kind of perhaps knows about this or has even heard it. For those of us that were working on this issue at that time, I you talk in the book about how, your wife listened to it, other people you knew had listened to it, but you couldn't bring yourself to listen to it. I have to admit I was the same. It took me a while to listen to it as well. It was too much for me to kind of listen to. It was almost too much. I already had that empathy and was already suffering vicariously from the people that I was in contact with. And it did kind of put me over the edge when I listened to it. I'm curious if you could reflect on what that did in the minds of the public and why.
The first few weeks of June, when the separations were at the height of the crisis, I remember having conversations with colleagues that, I wish there was an agent who had a conscience, right? There's got to be somebody in the Border Patrol who will have a conscience, who will leak a photograph or a video from inside the detention centers, inside the Border Patrol stations. And once people see how children and adults are being held, that will do it. That will turn the tide, because we weren't getting through. I didn't feel that there was enough outrage against the policy. People were still blaming the parents, saying, well, no, it's the parents' fault because they crossed the border illegally. And days passed and nothing, until on a Monday night, finally, an audio leaked And you all may have heard about it or heard it. It's about 8 minutes long. ProPublica leaked it. And all you hear for the better part of 8 minutes is the voices of children crying and asking for mommy and daddy to come nonstop. That's from inside one of the facilities. It's extremely painful to listen to. So if you haven't, like Nan was saying, I was like, why am I going to listen to this at the time after hearing it from the parents, right? I didn't feel like I needed to put myself through that. That audio was released on a Monday night. And by Wednesday at 2 p.m., the president signed an executive order that did not end the separations completely, but significantly reduced the numbers, right? The scale was no longer the same. Hearing that audio, hearing those voices really turned the broad American public, even people who were for the policy before, once they heard what it sounded like, that was too much. It got to them at a visceral level. And I'm convinced that the reason that was the case, right? The reason that audio was so powerful and much more powerful than a video or a photograph would have been, is because when you hear those children cry, you don't see the color of their skin. And all children cry the same. So people started thinking, those could be my kids, or that was me when I was a kid. They were able to see themselves and their own children in those cries in a way that they hadn't been able to do before. And that has gotten me thinking ever since about why is it that we give certain arbitrary things so much significance that prevents us from feeling empathy and compassion for fellow human beings. We had been saying for weeks that what the parents were telling us, parents were crying on camera in some cases, but it was these cries that really got through. Why is it that we give so much significance to things like skin color, place of birth, immigration status, language, and so many other things? And how do we harness that empathy and compassion, right? How can we replicate it so that not just when it comes to immigration, but all of our social policies, that we're able to see fellow human beings, even if they are different from us in many ways, religion, age, disability, sexual orientation, you name it, at a very basic level, we're all human beings. So there's got to be some base level of empathy and compassion that has to get through. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge every day to have policies that reflect such empathy and compassion. And I hope that readers of the book grapple with this question at a personal level, right? For each one of us, what are the things that we give so much significance to? Criminal history and so many other things. I think it's a very challenging question, and one that I thought that audio and the result from it encapsulates very specifically in a way that few things do.
It's one of the most powerful parts of the book, I think, is when you kind of go through the history of our immigration laws and tie it to racial justice issues. Frankly, you know, it's all part of the same history. Before we open up to some questions, can you talk a little bit about the title of the book and "My Boy Will Die of Sorrow," where that came from?
Yes, I think we have a little bit of time, and I will read a very brief excerpt to answer that question. And that is from the very first day in court, that first day that I talked about at the beginning of the call, of the webinar, when I was interviewing one of the parents. I was speaking to Lionel, who was also from Guatemala. He was less than a year younger than me and wore a plaid short-sleeved shirt, white with dark and light blue lines, and cowboy-style buttons, the kind you snap together. He must have been no taller than 5 feet 7 inches. In broken Spanish, he explained that he had come with his 11-year-old son, Daniel. Like Viviana and Sandro, another family, they were traveling alone and they were inseparable. He and Daniel were both first-time crossers and had no family in the United States. They were hoping to apply for asylum due to the persecution they had faced in their indigenous village. I got all the critical information from Leonel, but I still couldn't believe that the agents had not given him any information about his son, where he was being taken, or who would take care of him. Surely the agents must have told him something about the process and about what to expect, I thought. What do you think would happen, I asked Leonel, if you are deported and your son doesn't go with you, if he stays here? He looked down as if thinking about it, and when he looked up, he shook his head. His look was one of resignation. No, pues, mi niño se muere de tristeza. My boy will die of sorrow. For a second, my eyes didn't leave his. I struggled to write down what he was telling me. I pursed my lips and looked down, swallowed hard, and couldn't find words to respond. That conversation is where the title of the book comes from. And it's really meaningful to me that the title is not even my voice, but the voice of one of the families impacted by this cruel policy.
Thank you, Efrén. So we have one question, you're in as good a position as anybody to answer this. What does a better system look like to you in terms of processes and timeframes? Behind this question is, an impression that maybe the immigration approval process is taking so long as perhaps a deliberate structure to discourage immigration. And so the question is really an invitation for you to imagine what a better system looks like.
Yeah, I think the process takes long sometimes, but not always. Certain processes don't take very long. You probably have seen news reports recently of the governor of Texas sending buses from Texas to DC and Chicago and New York City, or the governor of Florida sending flights of migrants from San Antonio to Martha's Vineyard. Think about who's on those buses and those flights. What do they look like? Where are they from? Because what I bet none of you have seen are reports of buses or flights of Ukrainian asylum seekers. When it comes to Ukrainian asylum seekers, we were somehow able to find the staff, the resources, the political will to process thousands of them in a very short period of time. That process did not take long at all. And I'm glad we did that because they deserved it, they needed it. They were fleeing a horrendous situation in their country. But so are the Haitian asylum seekers trying to come into our border and apply for asylum. And we receive them on horseback and with a whip. So I share that example as a premise to answering that question, just to make sure we understand that not all processes take long. Somehow, sometimes, for certain immigrants, we find it in our political will to process them very quickly. Now, there's hundreds of thousands of immigration court cases backlogged, and the process at the border takes very long for most people. Some people say this is an intractable problem. We can't figure it out. And I'm not saying it's easy, but we figure out a way to do heart transplants, to land rockets on Mars. Give me a break, right? That's hard. This is not hard. This is a matter of political will, right? And a couple of simple things that could be done that doesn't even require an act of Congress is to throw more resources. And I'm not talking about a 50% increase. I'm talking about 10x, 20x to our asylum processing system so that families who need to apply for asylum have a caseworker assigned to them who can be their support system through the process. And we have tried that before, and over 99% of the people showed up to all of their appointments and successfully completed their process, right? So on the asylum side of things, it's a matter of political will, and that's all it is. On the economic immigrants, that is challenging. I will grant you that. The border between the United States and Mexico is the longest land border in the world between a developed country and a developing country, to use shorthand. And we have a shortage of workers in the US right now. And there's an oversupply of inexpensive labor on the southern side of the border. It's economics 101. Find a way to marry those two. Now, we have a guest worker program or multiple guest worker programs that are not working well, that are rife with abuse. So I'm not advocating for expanding those programs without addressing the underlying issues with them. But I am saying that from the economic side of it, the forces of supply and demand of labor will always be there. And no matter how tall a wall we build, they are inescapable, right? So we've got to find a way to meet the need with the supply. And this is hard, but we can figure it out. It's a matter of political will that gets in the way.
Right. Thanks, Efrén. So I think just the final question is, what do you hope people will take away from the book after they're done reading it? What do you hope the readers will do?
Well, I hope that most readers will grapple with the question that we were discussing a few minutes ago about empathy and compassion in their own lives, whether they are immigrants or no immigrants or not, but in any aspect of their life, how we grapple with that question, right? Can we pierce through the arbitrary things and see everyone we interact with as a fellow human being? And when it comes to immigration issues, I hope the book pushes people to see beyond the headlines and understand that behind every immigrant story there's a father, a child, a sibling. And like all of us, we're complex human beings with our flaws and our hopes and dreams. And none of us chose where we were born. And I hope I get to see the day where the place of birth does not determine how we fare in our society.
Thank you so much, Efrén and Nan, for this great discussion. It's very eye-opening to hear you talk about these parents and their children and what they've suffered through this separation policy. So it's really emotional. Thank you so much for all the hard work that you have put in to help these families and to tell their stories. So we really appreciate both of your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nan, for moderating, and thank you to everyone who joined us. It's a difficult subject. Thank you for being part of the conversation.
My pleasure.